Alright, so today I'm going to be showing a couple different ways to make fancy bases, as I call them, with cork sheeting. So I buy this stuff. It's 12 inches by 12 inches and then a 1/4 inch thick. I buy this in packs of, packs of 12 sheets for $18. So, I mean, this stuff will last you for 12 sheets will last you for probably 2 whole armies, if not more. So it lasts quite a long time. And then we're also going to use some other basing materials to help the cork not look like cork as much. So yeah. So there's 2 basic ways to do cork. The first way is to just stack it up with the pieces horizontal. The other way is to put your pieces vertical and line them up next to each other. Both ways have their merits. Just kind of depends on what you're going for. So I'm going to do 2 different bases. I'm going to use this one for the stacking and having your pieces vertical. And then I'll use this one to show the horizontal pieces. And I'll start with that one. So basically the first thing you want to do when you're starting off with this kind of method is to just place your base on the cork. And then I just like to rip out a section of cork and then just tear off chunks like this to get roughly the shape of your base. If it hangs off a little bit, not a big deal. We're going to mess with that later. And then save these chunks because we will use them. Not necessarily in this project, but you can always use them for something. I have many drawers filled with just extra chunks that can be used for all sorts of things. So then we have our basic base of the base, as you would say, I guess. So then the job is to just make a couple more of these, depending on how high you want your base. So I'm just going to rip off another piece, and then just pull this stuff off to roughly the same size. And I think I'll do it one more time. Pull these bits off. Alright. So there's our base. But that, just on its own, looks pretty boring. That, you can see the cork layers and stuff, and you don't really want cork looking like cork. You want to try to avoid as much as possible. So from here, I think what I'll do is, I'll just get some smaller pieces, maybe like that or so, and I'm just going to stack them up on this other side here, or on this side, just sort of haphazardly stacking them. And I always try to lay out the whole base before I start gluing anything. And then I think we'll get some little pieces like this. And I think that'll be as far as we go. You do have to keep in mind that you do have to get a miniature on these bases. So depending on how your miniature sits, in my mind, I don't have a miniature for this base, but in my mind, the miniature is going to sit with his back leg back here, front leg up there, sort of sideways pose. So I think that'll work. So then I'm just going to take some regular old super glue. In this case, I'm using Gorilla Glue. And I'm going to start at the bottom, and I'm just going to glue on to the base. So I'll take this bottom layer, and I'll glue that to the base. Oh, and by the way, this is a 50 millimeter base. So if you play Warhammer, that's Centurion or Obliterator size. If you're not familiar with Warhammer, then 50 mil is 5 centimeters, which is about 2 inches across. I'm just going to glue the next layer, press it down, and then glue the last of these initial layers down. Just like that. Press it down. And I'm going to put the base in this thing. Make it a little easier to see. There we go. So then I have these little chunks. I'm going to start with this one. Just pull it off. I like to keep them stacked, even when they're not on the thing, though. And then just push that down. And then do the next chunk. that. And then I'm going to pull off all of these, put some super glue where they're going to go. And if you're going to use super glue, you can use different things, but if you're going to use super glue, you want to put more super glue down than you think you would need normally, because the cork will soak up a lot of the glue and sometimes not want to stick. And then the last piece here. Alright, there we go. So then I'm just going to push these down, make sure they're really tight in there. Good. Good. Alright. So then, the next step is this stuff, like, as you can see the cork lines in this pretty easily. So we're going to start by just taking X-Acto blade. I like to use a dull one in case I slip. I don't completely just ruin my fingers. And I'm just going to start sort of carving away the edge of this cork. This is a messy process. You will get little bits of cork everywhere. I just usually vacuum or sweep up after I'm done. And if you keep all the little filings and stuff, you can use them as basing texture down the line. So I recommend sweeping them into a little container or something. So I'm just going to carve away at this. Basically just wanting to carve away any solid edges that we see that are looking like cork. I'm going to try to eliminate as much of that as possible with this step. I'm just going to do that. So there we go. Now you can see that was 2 layers, but now it's a little bit harder to tell that there was cork there. And then here also there's 3 layers there, but you can, compared to over here, you can definitely see the lines there. They're starting to be hidden there. So that's what we want. So I'm just going to do this all the way around, including on this rock here. And so because you're carving some away like this, you always want to build your formations a little bit bigger than what you want your final piece to look like, since you will be cutting away a decent chunk of it. And if you have overhangs like this, I always like to carve under the overhang, so you can still have an overhang that exists in the natural world. So just carving away, eliminating anything that looks like cork, that looks like layers, at least as much as possible. And on the flat areas especially, you can leave some, but I try to eliminate as much as possible. So there we go. And then we have this flat section here, and we know we're going to need to put a miniature there eventually. So we don't want to mess it up too much, but I like to just dig out a spot like this maybe. Just cut a little indent in there. And then just smooth out the edges, just so it looks at least a little bit like the rock is deformed, not completely flat all over the place there. And don't want it to look too circular, so I'll just carve out a little bit more. Alright, and there you go. So there's our basic rock formation. So the next thing we're going to do, just slide all these crumbs out of the way. Next thing we're going to do is take some texture paint. In this case, I'm using Armageddon Dust. And just get a crappy old brush, because texture paint will get into the bristles of the brush and potentially ruin it. So then you just want to get some of this texture paint and just kind of spread it around here on the cracks that are left from the separation in the cork. And this, the texture paint, the natural texture of this will sort of blend with the cork and help hide those seams, because seams do not exist in nature. So we want to hide those as much as possible. Just want to go all over the miniature. making sure to hide as many seams as possible. The painting process will also help hide some of these, and we're going to do 2 more steps after this that will also help hide them. But basically just want to be eliminating as many seams as possible with every step. So the carving step, we did as much as we could. And now this step, we're doing as much as we can. And then the next step, we'll do as much as we can. And then the final step. And then it's down to painting. And if there's a seam left here or there, if you're taking it to a competition, yeah, the judges will notice. But if you're just using it as a gaming piece, it's not really that big a deal. Every now and again, you might see it and be like, I wish I'd hid that seam. But it's really not the end of the world. No one will notice, especially if you have a really cool miniature sitting up on your base. And I like to throw a bit of this texture around the flat areas also, just to give them a little bit of definition. I also don't bother hiding seams that no one will ever see. So for instance, the seam in there, it's going to be a miniature on this base eventually. So I'm not super worried about hiding that seam. Alright, so, no, I see a couple more right here. Right there. Alright, so that is pretty much all of our seams hidden. Oh, no. It's an everlasting step here. There we go. Alright, so that's basically all our seams hidden. So now what we're going to do is we're going to take a couple different grits of texture. So for this, I'm using pigment powder. Doesn't matter the color, I'm just using gray. And I'm going to take a little bit like sand style grit. And make sure to put it over something like this box here. And then I'm just going to sprinkle a little bit of this heavier grit in a couple places. I don't want tons of this stuff. Just a little bit. Just in a couple places here and there. Alright. And then just tap off the extra. And then I'm going to take some of this pigment powder, which is a very, very fine grit. And I'm just going to scoop some of it out and just throw it sort of haphazardly onto our base here. It'll stick to the wet texture paint and give us some nice seam hiding ability as well as some extra texture on our cork. And then just tap the extra off. This stuff likes to stick to itself, so probably have to do some vigorous tapping. You can also blow it off. You just want to be careful that when you're blowing this off, that your line of air does not intersect with your pot of pigment, or else you will have a giant mess. I'm just going to tap this off. All right. And so there is our textured base. All our seams are hidden. And then the only thing we have left to do is prime it and paint it. So we'll set that aside. That's the stacking method, where you just take your cork and just stack it on up. So now we're going to do the other way, which is putting your pieces vertically on your base. And this way you can build a lot of height really quickly, and it takes longer to build depth, or width, I guess. The nice thing about this is, like, so for instance, if I just stick this on here, this is probably, in terms of height, this is probably what, maybe 10, maybe, I don't know, let's see. Let's just stack these up real quick and see how high this is. 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Yeah, just above 9 pieces of cork high. So, just in terms of the savings in cork, you've saved a whole bunch. This is a single piece of cork that's that tall versus the 9, almost 10 pieces we needed to get that height vertically. So, just going to start the same way, except this time I'm not worried about getting the shape of the base. I'm just going to rip off a piece that I think looks good and go to town. So I think this is probably a little bit too big, so I'll just break some off there. I think that looks good, so we'll start with this. So then I'm just going to I'm going to save this piece out actually. Then I'm just going to do the same thing I did before. Lay this on here, grab another piece of cork, and just rip off these side bits until we have roughly the same shape. Good. And do this a couple more times. Okay. I think one more time, and then we'll start to taper it down. Pull these off. All right. So now I'm going to start taking some of these other shapes. And like how I laid out the whole base before, I'm going to do a similar thing here, except I'm not going to lay out both sides of the rock. I'm just going to do one, glue this, flip it over, do the other. So I think that looks about good. So now instead of gluing from the bottom up, I'm going to glue from the top down on this kind. Now, it doesn't really matter, I don't think. It's just personal preference. So I'm just going to glue that down. Move that up a little bit. And I'm not super worried about the bottom being regular because I'm going to come back and fix that at the end. And it's more of just a fix. It's actually a feature of doing it this way. You can get some added interest in your base by doing one of our final steps we're going to do. I'm just attaching these. Alright, so there's our rock, tapered down to half. I'm just going to rip a little bit of this off. This one's a little too big, I think. That'll work. Alrighty, then I'm just going to grab some more cork here. And this will work. Go with that. And then maybe this. And then I think that. That'll work. So then we just glue this down again. Oh, sometimes the glue doesn't like to stick. It's okay. So I think that's all the layers. Yep, that's all the layers. So then I'm just going to compact this really tightly. Alright, and then we're going to go into the same thing that we did before. We're going to take our X-Acto knife, in this case a dull one, because again, I don't want to hurt myself, and just start shaping the rock. So we're just trying to taper all these edges down to a nice shape, and just like before, the pieces are going to go everywhere, but that's okay. And you want to try to not just be tapering edges, but giving some interest to your rock. So I'm digging in a little bit more here. Dig in a little less in other places. Let's see. The more of a taper you add, though, the more your seams will be hidden. And you can see the glue soaking into the cork really helps this bind together quickly. 2 pieces of plastic that you glued together with super glue, you could not be this rough with a knife. It would break apart. That you glued this recently, I mean. So, the super glue and this cork will stick together like no tomorrow. Just gonna get as much of this edge off as I can here. There we go. Just break off any loose bits, because you don't want to have those bits break off once you have paint on it. Depending on what color you painted your rock, that will look a little weird. So there we go. That looks pretty good. So then, what we're going to do is, instead of just gluing our rock on like that, and just, there's a base and there's this rock centered right in the middle of it, we're going to take our little razor saw here, and I think I'm just gonna cut an angle in the bottom. Doesn't really matter what angle you go for. There we go. Let me get nice and flat there. And then we glue our rock on. Now our rock has sort of an abnormal, or really a normal angle to it. Since rocks are not perfectly straight up and down all the time, they sort of jut out of the ground. And then you can sort of cock it to the side. And I think I'm going to put it on the back half of the base here, like this. So I'm just going to go ahead and glue it down after I notice there's an edge right here. Just going to get rid of that. Good. Then I'm going to go ahead and glue it down. Like that. That looks good. And then, I think even farther back. Then on the front half of this base, just to make it not like there's just a random boulder out in the middle of nowhere, I'm going to use a little bit of cork and use the other method and just do a little stack off there on the side, just to make it seem like this is a field of boulders or something, not just a random boulder. I'm sure random boulders do happen, but more often than not, you see boulders that are with other rocks. So I'm just going to quickly shape this little guy. Looks good. And glue him down. Alright, and there you go. So there's the other method of doing that. So then we do the exact same thing we did before. Take our texture paint, which I have misplaced. It's here somewhere, I'm sure. There it is. So we take our texture paint again. And we take our brush that we don't care about. And we just go in and start hiding some seams. So once I do this, I will pull out some examples of some ones that are dried and have miniatures on them, and then some that have been primed, and then some that have been painted. So you can see all the different iterations. So sometimes there's seams, like this seam is going to be really hard. It's quite large to hide with the texture paint. So I'm just going to remember to come back to it with the grit and make sure to get a good amount of grit on it. So I'm just going to... And you can also just use, for attaching the grit, you can use glue or just normal paint if you want. That will hold just fine. I prefer the texture paint just because it has some grit in it, and so it just assists in that process even more. But you can just use glue or normal paint. It is not a problem. So that looks good. There's probably a couple more seams to hide, but You guys have already seen this process, so I'm not super worried about it. And then again, we just take our 2 types of grit. And I'll start with the heavier stuff, and I'll just sprinkle, especially that seam I was talking about. Sprinkle a good amount on there, and then just in a couple other places. And once this texture paint dries like concrete practically, so it'll hold all that stuff on there pretty well. I'm just going to take a little bit of our finer grit. And put it on there. There we go. And just bang off the extra. Blow off the extra over here. Alright, and there is our second example of a cork rock, but this time using vertical pieces of rock. So there you go. There's the two ways you can do it, horizontal or vertical. So then let's take a look at some examples. So here are some examples of the cork with big old miniatures attached to them. As you can see, you can do things like this guy is leaping off this rock here. Hold it on there. You can do things like that. Other guys are just standing on the rock. So there's some that are dry. Then let me pull out another example. So this is a pretty extreme example, but this dragon dude is sitting up on this rock like this. Sitting up on this one. And that used a good chunk of cork, but, I mean, pennies, really. And then we come to some painted examples. Oh, and that last example was primed, by the way. So then we have some painted examples. So we have things like this. Just a simple mound, really, with this chaos guy riding up it. Then we have sort of like a plinth of rock. This one I think I hid the layers really well. Can't really see them there. Standing up there like that. And then there's another example somewhere. Oh yeah, here he is. And then you can do complex things. Those two were just stacks, but you can also do complex things. Like this, I made a cave, sort of, with 2 little column stacks. And then in there is a resin waterfall coming out of there with a roof and all that. So you can do some pretty complex things. And then you can also, you don't have to have all your cork in one place. Like on this, there's multiple spires of the cork, and the dragon is clutching onto them. So there's all sorts of things you can do with cork, really, like, as far as your imagination can take you, to be honest. But it can be super simple all the way to super complicated. But hopefully you guys learned at least something from this video. Or maybe you saw me doing this cork and you're like, nope, that looks terrible, never doing that. And now you'll know to stay away from cork forever. Whatever. You can learn to do something or learn to not do something. At least you're learning. But that'll do it for this episode. Thank you everybody for watching. I'll be on the main Galactic channel on Wednesday doing something D&D beginner related. And then back here on Friday working on some more Warhammer stuff. So, like I said, thank you everybody for watching, and I will see you next time.